How many of you guys here are currently utilizing Vsphere? Okay, that's good. How many is anybody on Vsphere 6? Got a couple? 5.5? Anybody on older versions? Okay, that's all right too. Just checking it out. All right, that's good to know. Now, first thing, we're going to be talking a little bit about best practices, right? And I'm sorry, I have to get in my consulting mode. Best isn't best for everybody, okay? A best practice is a guideline. That's it. What is good for one company is not good for another, which is why when Tom and I set up to do designs for some of the companies that we do, we spend a lot of time investigating what's going on with their current environment, what needs to be different. We have a baseline that we start from, but very seldom do two designs look alike. Very seldom. So everything that I'm going to be sharing with you guys is a good baseline. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Don't say, Duane said that would be the best, so it has to be. Don't mess with it. You got to spend a little bit of time testing in your environment to see what's actually going to work. All this hardware that we use, everything functions differently, right? Everything's going to have a little bit different performance, so you got to keep that in mind as well. All right, so infrastructure management best practices. Had a nice discussion today with the guys in class and found out that most of the virtual machines that they manage from the VMware console rather than SSH or using RDP as an administrator. That might be okay if you have an unlimited amount of resources. But that console actually takes quite a bit of CPU power on the host in order to manage it. And that CPU power is coming from the management kernel called the VM kernel. And guess how many CPUs the management kernel can use on a host? 1. Core 0. All of the VM kernel processes that it performs happens on a single core. It does not use any of the other ones because it uses all the other ones for the virtual machines, and that's the way it's designed to help push that along. So when you start thinking about having performance issues, not necessarily on the VM, but maybe the host even keeping up, if you had a number of Microsoft administrators or a number of Linux administrators consoled in, that could potentially affect some of the performance. So one of the things we say is, we don't do that. The console is a backup. We do the management through the normal management interfaces, RDP or SSH. All right? So how's that for causing some issues? Also, it helps with some security. I remember my very first trip to Montana. I was doing a class there. This was not a consulting job. And there was a gal in the classroom. She works for one of the government agencies there in Helena. And we were going through looking at the console. And I said, why don't you close the console off? Did. So now open it back up. So they opened it back up. And she goes, oh, I don't have to log in. I said, well, that's one of the things I wanted you to realize. Just because you close the console doesn't mean that it logs you out. You have to wait for that timeout to occur. So if we're using the console and somebody forgets to log out, somebody else logs in, that person can be utilizing your credentials on that virtual machine. I was consulting for the Dutch police, and they brought us in to develop the forensics process for a virtual infrastructure because they had a case before them that had just exactly what I said happened in an environment in one of the businesses there. A second administrator came in to a console of somebody else that had already been utilizing it, committed a crime under their name, and we had to help them develop the forensics process on that virtual infrastructure so that they could follow through to verify that the person that really did it, not the person that the logs look like performed it, right? Because you end up with conflicting logs there. And at that time, it was Vsphere 4.1 at that time, and there was some major issues with regards to how the logging was recorded and what was being done with regards to the console session. So kind of some interesting stuff there. So we avoid utilizing that console for management if at all possible. Now, that took way longer than I expected to cover. All right. I wasn't expecting to talk about the Dutch police. That just came to my head. All right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Wherever that VM resides, it'll be using the CPU on that host to present the console to it. Good question. So if you've got, you won't notice a whole lot if you got 10 VMs open on 10 different hosts. You won't notice much at all. Yeah, good question. Good question. All right. So this is the old tried and true. Just because you're in a virtual infrastructure and you have access to everything under the sun doesn't mean you shouldn't be focused on separation of duties, right? I run into a lot of issues from time to time. I was working with Europol here one time where the networking guys were not allowing the VMware administrators to do what really should be done related to VLANs in the virtual infrastructure. So all that we ended up doing is said, well, let's get down to the separation of duties. Let's train the network guys on vSwitches, distributed switches, and let's let them manage it. And then they went ahead and did things the way they should be done rather than skipping that over. So sometimes when it comes down to separation of duties, you got to think a little bit about what's happening. And most of you probably have some type of policies, right? One of the things that we have to not forget about, one of the common ones, right? One user, one account, right? So what happens when you're managing an ESXi host? What account are you using? Root. Is that one user, one account? No, it's not. 5.5 and 6.0, you can actually drop root altogether. They removed the command SU. You can't even substitute a user on 5.5 and 6.0 on the ESXi host. So when you create an administrator, they have full root level privileges on that host. Use Active Directory integration. Put all your users that are in there in a folder called ESX admins. Do Active Directory integration. Voila. They log in as their user instead of the root account. You can keep that thing locked down, right? Just one simple example. Everybody hates me for this one. Isolation of the management network, right? Before we get, I won't talk about that here. I'm going to go through a couple of other components. So this is a very generic start of a design. What I want you to notice here is that, look on the top right. We have two NICs associated with a virtual switch. Why two NICs? First of all, verify redundancy. Second of all, how does VMware actually handle routing of the virtual machines? How are you going to maintain high-level performance when you have 50 virtual machines? I've got some clients that have 400 running virtual machines on a single host. You're not going to run 400 virtual machines on a single host through two 1 gig NICs, right? And you're definitely not going to do it on one. So what I'm getting at here is you got to have some redundancy, and you got to make sure that you're having the multiple paths available so that the host can manage the movement of the virtual machines and maximize performance across all of those NICs. So the one thing you always got to keep in mind, make sure we've got redundancy built into it. And notice we have management physically separated from production. Now, you may not be able to do that, but you can at least VLAN them. Separate them via VLANs at a minimum. If you can physically isolate them, great. Notice this little thing down here? You guys all like vMotion, right? It's a pretty cool feature. We like to physically isolate vMotion. Biggest reason, not only does it use a ton of bandwidth, but all of the vMotion traffic. So when you're moving that running VM from one host to another, we're moving live memory. That is all clear text. There is nothing encrypted. There is no encrypted session in there. VMware does not have a means to encrypt it. Having it isolated is the best way to go about having that, verifying their separation, and things are going to work well. Okay? So now let's talk about, what do I mean when I say isolate the management network? How are few who are sitting in the production network going to access the management environment? That is the biggest hurdle. What we're normally doing is setting up some type of a jump box, at minimum some type of an ACL, that would limit access into that management environment. In this example here, we have a virtual switch set up that we can enter through an ACL. See, I got a firewall up there that gives us connectivity into a virtual machine that maybe has RDP, maybe it's a Citrix environment, maybe we're using VDI, a lot of different options. It's a jump box. From there, and only from there, can I then connect into the rest of the management environment. But the question is, okay, great, that makes a lot of sense, but don't I need a domain controller? Don't I need access to different items? Yes, you do. And that will all depend, how you end up setting this up will all depend upon your level of risk, right? And they're going to vary across the board. Some companies, you go to a bank, that management environment has everything of its own, totally independent, totally separate. They're going to have their own domain controller. They're going to have their own DNS. They're going to have, in some cases, they will not have a gateway at all because they will have absolutely no access to the outside world. Got a friend of mine that manages a bank in Oklahoma City, manages security for it. He's been there for 13 years. Since he's been there, there's been absolutely 0 breaches. And he's put a half a dozen guys in jail that have tried to hack his environment, okay? Kind of fun to be around the guy. He's a lot of fun to he acts really, really stupid, but he's one of the smartest guys I've ever met. Those guys are dangerous, right? They act and look dumb, but they're not. Those guys are dangerous. Anyways, so what does he do? He separates as many layers of separation as he can. He separates. And that has been able to allow him to catch people as they're trying to come in from the outside in. His management environment is quite a number of layers deep. And yes, you are not going to manage his environment from home. Okay? Canadian government did some work with them, depending on which division you're in. VPN into the office, but you ain't going to be able to get to this management environment because that's another VPN. The only way you can manage their environment is through a VPN from inside the office. That's the way they have it set up. And it works. Good morning. I've got an alarm going off here for that's kind of interesting. How about I dismiss that? I don't know how it's morning. It said good morning. Any questions with regards to this isolation of the management network? I won't ask how many are doing that. If you're doing it, you're ahead of the game. Okay? All right, so the top 4 mistakes that I see made. I do get to travel around quite a bit, and some of these you might be going, come on, Duane, really? Like this one here. Not using VMware tools. You guys are like, what the heck? That's a mistake? Last year, I can't believe this was last year. Last year, I was invited to do some consulting for an organization that I won't name. It was the worst implementation of VMware I have ever seen in 6-7 years. Never seen anything as bad as this, okay? One of the things that was interesting, so by the way, my primary background before virtualization is security, so that's why you hear a bunch of that weird stuff. That was hard to figure out, wasn't it? There was no hint. It was really hard to figure out. Anyways, so this guy his claim to fame was security, and he would not install VMware tools because it was a security risk. Would not install VMware tools because it was a security risk. He actually went and removed all of the files that you need on the Linux servers to even install VMware tools because he didn't need them. All right? Found it really interesting. That was overkill, by the way. Okay? That was overkill. Now we were looking at we got called in because things were not working. They were losing data. Things were crashing. Not work. It's like, dude, install VMware tools and 90% of your problems are going to go away. Well, we can't do it. Anyway, we installed VMware tools and 90% of their problems went away. That was a hard fix. That's a good question. So And that is a fun one. No, it's a very good question. I had a lot of fun with that over the years, okay? So first of all, right, we got to remember there's two different types of hypervisors. Hypervisor type 1, ESXi, Hyper-V 3, Zen server, and then a hypervisor type 2, VMware Workstation, VirtualBox, okay? Hypervisor type 2 is installed on an existing OS. There has been VM escapes on a hypervisor type 2. Cloudburst has been one. There's been another one here recently related to serial ports, of all things. So there has been a few of them. On a hypervisor type 1, there has not been any known VM escapes, to my knowledge, outside of a lab environment where they had full access to the underlying code. Okay? Now, I'm going to add to that. There's been recently an attack that occurred, a theoretical attack that was proven. Yep, into the host. No. And VMware and Microsoft will both tell you it's not possible. And here's the biggest reason why. On a hypervisor type 1, with today's technology, and I don't remember the generation of the chipsets, if it was 7 or 8, but somewhere around that range, we started implementing for Intel extended page tables and for AMD rapid virtualization indexing. Those two virtualization technologies actually place the hypervisor at a root level, lower level, holistically controlling all of the hardware. The CPU locks the memory in place, and a virtual machine from the inside cannot escape out. The memory cannot escape out anything else because they have to own the underlying hardware in order for that to happen. And I have seen a number of companies that have attempted, both with Hyper-V and with Vsphere, and they've got documented writings on all the things that they have tried that just doesn't work. They can't make it happen. So it's kind of interesting because if you take a look at a lot of the executive type courses on security, they say that's the one of the major hacks you have to be concerned about. And I flip out because it doesn't even work. Why are you telling these guys to do this and it doesn't even work? So it's kind of interesting, right? But you would think that I do a lot of pen testing. Kind of decent pen testing. Okay, I'm not a coder, so I don't make my own hacks, and we just don't. Now, there's been some other attacks where we come in sideways on the hardware and are able to circumvent memory, but that's a totally different story. You've already got access to the management layer, and I'm telling you keep it separate so we don't have to worry about it. 98% of the attacks that have occurred in a virtual environment today on a hypervisor type 1 are occurring on the management layer, full stop. I don't count somebody hacking a driver and privilege escalation on the OS a hack against Vsphere just because it happened to be the driver that VMware provided. How's that any different than the driver that a GPU is going to provide, right? To me, it's no different. So that makes sense? So not installing VMware tools. VMware tools helps with a number of things, right? Disk performance, CPU coordination, memory mapping, quiescing or quieting the system for backups. And without it, your performance is going to really be poor. I don't care if it's Linux or Windows. You got to have it. And yeah. So who tells you? The Linux guys? For VMware tools? I haven't had that happen to me. Now, are you talking about drivers for hardware or the actual? I'd have to see that. No, I haven't seen that. That's a new one on me. Nope, I haven't. That's interesting. Mistakes made regarding VM performance. Just to name a few. And we're going to go through some other ones. And some of these things are kind of all blur together. So screensavers. Do you need screensavers on a virtual machine? And does it really make a difference It can if you have enough of them running. It takes CPU. It takes memory. Why make use of it? And bear in mind that I'm working in a lot of different types of environments. You know, I'll work in some environments where we have 10 large hosts for 20 VMs because they bought way more than they needed. And then I'd go the other way around. Intel, for example, when they look at buying a host and putting VMs on it, they want to have 160% overcommitment. So whatever those physical resources are, they want to have 160 more resources on the VMs that are sitting on that host to maximize the use of the environment. So some of these things make a huge difference in being able to get the most money out of your physical hardware. Right? Fun stuff. All right, so screensavers. Antivirus, anti-malware. I could spend a long time talking about this. What's the biggest thing to avoid? Disk scans with the agent during peak times. That will kill performance on these things. So make sure that is not happening during the times that those items are working. Have you run into that? What's the other problem, though? Oh, off-peak hours is when we do backups. Oh, crap. All of a sudden, we got to run into other issues. What are some other options out there? Agentless antivirus. Yes, now that is beneficial. ESET has that. Symantec does that as well. There's also what they call agentless. It's not really, but it's no agent inside the virtual machine. Whether you're talking about Kaspersky, McAfee, Trend Micro, Sophos, Symantec, they all have one now. So you actually, the agent actually goes on the host, and it scans the virtual machine from the outside in. 300% reduction of 300% reduction in CPU memory and disk usage during scan time. That's huge, right? What's the other benefit of that? When I end up getting a hack, which we know is going to happen sooner or later, because anybody can circumvent an antivirus solution just by changing the signature, which is not hard to do. I can teach you guys all to do it in about 10 minutes, okay? Circumvent an antivirus solution. We get hacked. What's the first thing that normally happens? Agent gets either shut off or prevented from updating. And then we're just sitting there and we got to wait until we hopefully figure it out, right? With the kind of newer solution that we're seeing with an agentless, it's kind of cool because no signature, all of a sudden there's a signature. But guess what? They can't turn off the agent on the host because they don't have access to it. They're going to find it. You're going to be alerted. It will either remove it or at least inform you about it. Quarantine the VM at minimum, if that's the way you have it set up. So there's some interesting things that can be done to help minimize performance of that, because that can be a big problem. And then don't forget to set your power option to high performance. It actually helps improve performance on your virtual machine. Don't use balance. Okay? Does make a difference. We're not talking about trying to preserve a battery life on a laptop. Right? All right. This one was funny. I've seen this a couple times. Inside your virtual machine, right? You can go in and you can set limits on CPU and memory. So what happens if you set a limit on your memory? That means that that virtual machine can never use more physical RAM than what you set for a limit. Now, if you give the VM 4 gigs of RAM and you set the limit at 4 gigs of RAM, no harm done. What happens when you come back in later and assign 8 gigs of RAM because it's not performing well enough and you forget to change the limit? You actually get 8, but where does the other 4 come from? Comes off of the disk. It actually gets swapped out to disk, so the other 4 gig of RAM is reading off a disk. Very slow. The performance usually ends up being worse. It's really kind of sad, but it's interesting. Now, I will tell you one use case for putting a limit on memory. Have you guys ever had VMware administrators that have complained about not having enough RAM? I need more RAM. It'll run better if I have more RAM. When I know it's not going to, I'll give them more RAM, put the limit on it, and they're happy. They see 16 gigs of RAM. They don't know that 12 of it's out to disk, and they think it's awesome. So there's a good use case, right? Now, it's not a good idea. We would hope we can train everybody and actually go in and prove whether it actually needs more or not. But putting limits directly on the VM for memory, not a good idea. It will, at some stage, it'll come back to bite you. Okay? We're not talking about resource pools. We're not talking about VApps. We're talking about an individual virtual machine. All right? Too many vCPUs. But more power is better, right? Let's talk about vCPUs. That is true. One of the things that is important for us to remember is that we've got to make sure that we're doing our homework on the applications. Correct? First of all, is it multi-threaded? No use having more than one vCPU if the application's not multi-threaded. Now, what I want to tell you guys is why we keep the number as low as we possibly can based upon our given environment. So I'm going to walk through how a virtual CPU actually works and functions within a VMware environment. Okay? So first of all, you need to know that the processor is going to schedule a single thread of execution. Or if it's Intel hyper-threaded, it'll schedule 2 threads of execution per core. VMware functions as an SMP processor, symmetric multiprocessing. So it acts like an AMD proc. Okay? If you have Intel processors that are hyper-threaded, it will treat that one core as 2. That's how VMware will see it. All right? So if you have a 6-core processor, VMware will recognize it as 12. All right? What's next? I forgot. All right, so when the vCPU needs to be scheduled, it is going to communicate with the VM kernel. VM kernel is going to map it to a physical core. All right, that's pretty cool. So here's an example. You got 60 vCPUs on a host that has 24 physical cores, 48 threads. First time go around, those 60 want to happen. Guess what? 12 of them got to wait. They'll run 48, and then once they're done, the next 12 will take their turn, along with 36 others. You know, because they'll just keep piling in there. Now, what's important to take note is look at the right VM. There's 2 virtual CPUs. They're going to try to keep the single VM on one processor, one memory bank, a non-uniform memory access on a physical system. They're going to map that way. What I want you to take note of is that those 2 virtual CPUs will not be able to execute until there are 2 physical threads available simultaneously. So as an example, if you gave a virtual machine 8 virtual CPUs, it has to sit and wait for 8 physical threads to be available before it will execute. Now, how do we understand that? They developed a statistics called the ready time. The ready time is not something you normally see. Normally you see a wait time on a physical CPU, right? With the ready time, now we're dealing with, okay, my CPU is ready to go. It's asked for some, it's ready, and it's waiting. And it's ready, but it's waiting. And it's still waiting. Because you think about how that all happens. We had one, remember I just got done telling you last year, some of the worst setups I'd ever seen. So this individual not only didn't have VMware tools installed, every virtual machine had 4 NICs connected to 4 different networks. No redundancy. Anyways, and all of the virtual machines, for some reason, were connected to the DMZ. Don't understand it. So anyways, one of the other things that he had done is he'd taken his Postgres SQL servers, and he gave all of them 8 virtual CPUs. Now, if you've ever looked at the ready time is a problem. Usually a problem if it hits 4,000 milliseconds. Okay? So 4 seconds out of 20. If it is waiting for 4 seconds out of 20 total, it's usually causing an issue on usage. Not always, but usually. His was over 15,000 milliseconds. So for every 20 seconds, it was doing nothing for 15. And that was simply because he gave it too many virtual CPUs. We took that Postgres database and reduced it to 2. Ready state went to 2,000, usage went through the roof. That's pretty cool, right? So all we're getting at here is, I see that often. More vCPUs doesn't always mean better performance. You've got to pay attention to your hardware, and you got to pay attention to what the application actually needs. I usually demonstrate it. I'll usually demonstrate it. And what I'll usually end up doing is I'll set up an environment whereby we've maxed out we've maxed out the virtual CPUs on a number of different dummy systems. And then I've showed them how, as we add more vCPUs, you can actually watch on a graph. You set up a graph where you've got ready time and you've got usage. And if it's not doing much, they're both going to be low. And then as usage goes up, ready time shouldn't climb much, but it might climb a little bit. Well, what I end up doing is have usage go up, and then as the ready state comes up, the usage goes down. I end up inverting it. And so that's how it's easy to demonstrate. Because if you can prove as the ready time goes up that the usage drops off, we've got a problem, right? So that's how I do that. I just demonstrate it because it's new for a lot of people. Even people who have been using VMware for a long time, they still don't figure it out. We did some work for the Navy. The Navy took when they converted physical to virtual, whatever the settings were, whatever the physical characteristics were on the main systems, that's what they set the VMs at. So every VM had a minimum of 4 cores. And there was only 8 cores on the physical box that they installed everything on. And they didn't want to use VMware anymore because performance was bad. I understand that. Correct. Correct. And that is common as well. One of the biggest challenges I think that I have is you run into so many different varying statements from different consultants out there, right? And those guys are SharePoint experts. They're not VMware experts. And those guys are running from, when you look at some of the Microsoft statistics, even though they might be talking about a virtual machine, they're expecting you to put 1 or 2 virtual machines on that physical box. Not 40, not 60, not 400. It's a different story when we're trying to maximize the usage of our physical infrastructure. So and don't get me wrong, there's times where I've made the mistake and gone too low. And then we had to revert. But we always have to be weighing the difference between how am I maximizing my hardware costs versus whether or not we're actually getting the performance that we need to run our business. Even though I might be a security guy, I still understand that whether or not the business can work and run and function is the biggest thing that we need to take into consideration. What's that? Tell them to read the Phoenix Project. You read that? It's a good book. Phoenix Project. Just look it up. You'll enjoy it. It's one of my favorite books. And it takes a company, an individual. It's not a true story, but it's kind of based on real life. And it's about a guy's life that ended up becoming the manager of the IT environment of a complete disaster. And he's running from one problem to another. And they completely changed the way they're doing business over time. And the security guy falls off the bandwagon and then finally figures out that he needs to get on board with this and started doing things the way he should, and it worked out really well. It's an interesting. You guys have been around Six Sigma or heard of Lean Six Sigma a little bit? What they've kind of done in that book is, without telling you, they've kind of taken a lot of the Lean Six Sigma recommendations to running a business and applied it to the IT. Because IT is nothing but a manufacturing plant. We're building stuff all the time. We got different centers all over the place. We got to watch the flow. All right, enough said. Any questions about CPU? No? Okay, good. Did I bore you yet? Not yet, huh? All right. A few other items. Trusting the OS performance. stats. Inside the operating system, how are those stats designed? They're designed for physical hardware. They're not designed to read properly in a virtual environment. So just because an OS is saying something's wrong doesn't mean it is. Make sure you turn around and go inside or go outside and look at the stats on the actual vCenter environment or Hyper-V environment, whatever you want to do. All right. Another item, storage optimization. I won't ask what versions you guys are running. So we all know that we have Essentials, Essentials Plus, Standard, Enterprise, Enterprise Plus. The biggest, next to moving from an Essentials package that has 3 physical hosts and 1 vCenter. You got a question? Okay, oh, fly. Yeah, so three physical hosts and 1 vCenter. Moving from there to Standard is a big jump in cost. The biggest jump in cost is moving from Standard to Enterprise. Okay? It's like almost $2,000 per proc going from Standard to Enterprise. That's big. But yet there's only like 4 new features. Reliable memory. You guys care about reliable memory? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes it's no big deal. Big data. How many of you guys are using big data? You don't need it if you're not using big data. I don't remember the third one now. Might come to me. The fourth one, vStorage API for array integration. So VMware developed this from moving from 4 to 4.1 with the storage vendors. It's an API. I better move down here. It's an API that allows for full copy, block zeroing, hardware-assisted locking, thin provision primitive, all that kind of good stuff. Here's the big thing. This thing speeds up storage performance significantly. This is the only feature that really makes a big difference when you move from Standard to Enterprise. But you have to be at Enterprise version, and you have to have a supported SAN storage device. Heck, even a Synology NAS has a supported VAAI device. That's kind of weird. Something that cheap, right? All I'm getting at is one of the mistakes that I see out there is not actually paying attention to taking advantage of all of the different capabilities that these different systems have. So get matching hardware. If you're not going to have a SAN that supports these storage APIs, I'm not sure that you can actually prove a significant financial return moving from Standard to Enterprise license. It's all about ROI, right? Total cost of ownership. So you got to consider all those capabilities. They also added in version 5.0, they added in features for NAS as well. File cloning, reserving the space so you can actually do thick format if you wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So that's the vStorage APIs. Use them if you can. All right? Should you use a thin or thick disk? Very good. I like that. Depends if you're selling storage. We have 2 different types of thick disks. Right? Eager and lazy. The eager is going to zero fill the whole disk. The lazy is going to zero fill only what it needs. So in both of those instances, you're going to allocate 100% of the hard drive space. So in a worst case scenario, on a thick eager disk, you're going to have to write. That's it. Worst case scenario, on a lazy disk, you're going to have to zero fill and write. Now a thin provision, we don't allocate all the space. We only allocate what we need. So in a worst case scenario, you're going to have to allocate space, zero fill, and write. That's how it works in functions. Everybody would say, well, that only makes sense that the thick eager is going to perform the best. But the truth is that it doesn't matter in most cases. If you have 25% writes and 75% reads, I don't care which of those you choose, you'll get almost identical performance as long as you have storage APIs, VAAI. If you don't have VAAI, you probably better stick with thick eager. Because with VAAI, the SAN is doing the zero filling and the allocating, not the ESXi host. Happens stupid fast. Now, if you have an application, you have an application that is doing heavy writes a lot, it is going to give you a little bit better performance if you stick with a thick eager. But only in a high write situation. In an average day-to-day situation, it isn't going to matter. Okay, make sense? I didn't plan on it, but yeah, I'll share a little bit about that. Now, it is an interesting discussion, okay? So we've got layers here, right? You've got your physical SAN, you've got your virtual LUN, and you've got a virtual disk, right? That virtual disk writes to a virtual LUN and ends up sitting on a physical storage someplace. When it comes to the VMFS file system, the virtual machine file system that we format these LUNs in, there is no way to defrag. Doesn't matter. The SAN, it all depends upon the SAN provider. Now, it's interesting. A VM can get defragged. The question is does it really affect performance? And that is going to actually depend upon the SAN of choice. There is no issues or harm defragging a hard drive as long as you're not causing any performance issues or doing it elsewhere. In some SAN environments, because of the way that actually lays down on the SAN, there will be some there. So if you use an SSD drive, probably not going to make a difference. Yeah. SSD is probably not going to matter. Probably not going to matter. Well, what are you talking about? It's a virtual disk. It's fun that way. That's I was at a hospital in western Iowa. They had an issue with VMware View that they were months trying to get figured out. Another consulting firm that they've worked with for years had been in there doing some work, and they did this is totally different, but I start thinking about what a consultant can do to screw things up for people. The consultant had come in to do upgrades for them. The guy upgraded ESXi, but didn't upgrade vCenter, and didn't upgrade VMware View, just totally out of order. When you do that stuff, you got to do vCenter first, and actually, depending their environment, you didn't have to. Sometimes you have to do the SSO, then vCenter. But there's also you got to do Composer before you do vCenter. A couple of other things with View. He didn't do it in order, and what ended up happening is they ended up having both a corrupted database and a corrupted persona, and it caused some users to get kicked out. I started thinking about how us consultants can screw things up for clients, you know. So it took me that. At least it wasn't my fault. All right. Another item here is take advantage of multipathing. Unless you're using, storage. So we're talking about storage. I almost got myself off to virtual machines. Okay, storage. VMware does not do lag. One path active at a time. One path active at a time means we need multiple paths to get the best performance out of this thing. There's a lot of stuff that pulls together along this lines, right? VMware, if you're using, and we'll look at a slide in a moment, if you're using their native multipathing, you have fixed path, most recently used, and round robin. Round robin is going to get you the best performance as long as you change the IOP to 1 instead of the default 1000. So there you go. Enough stuff, right? Now, multipathing. Well, I was going to get ahead of myself. So multipathing. You've got to do multipathing in order to get the best performance out of storage. And here is what I just made mention of. Round robin is going to give you the best option. And if you set the IOPS to 1, that will generally give you the best all-around performance. So every single IOP, it's going to run down a different path. Boom, 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 boom. Helps improve performance just a little bit, okay? Now, when it comes to multipathing, we do recommend, if at all possible, to use the vendor multipathing software. On this side over here, I guess to be your right, this is VMware's native multipathing. They designed native multipathing to be fairly generic. They do have a storage array type plugin or a driver for all the different vendors out there. But it is nowhere, no way, no how going to get you maximum performance on a specific storage device. Whereas if you go with the vendor's multipathing solution, you will see significant improvement. Significant improvement. And I have seen this time and time again. I don't care if you're talking about a Dell EqualLogic or an EMC VNX. You will see significant improvement. Anywhere from, the worst I saw was a 40% improvement. The best I saw was almost 1,000% improvement from what it was previously. There's a big range in there. You will get improvement. And even though EMC charges for it, it's still worth it. You do have to have Enterprise Edition or higher in order for you to be able to utilize these multipathing plugins, but they are worth it. Okay? Enough said, right? What about making use of the new vVols for Vsphere 6? Anybody using that? Of course not, because there's, well, maybe. We've got a couple on 6. Anybody using vVols? Now, we're not going to spend all day on virtual volumes. I set in, this might have been 3 years ago. I was in Cleveland, and I set in on a VMware users group, and they brought in a storage expert. The question was asked, how many LUNs, which I will get to in a moment, how many LUNs should I create in order to maximize performance on my environment? And the storage expert fired back, you need to create 1 LUN for every virtual machine. Now, I'm going to go down to another slide here and then come back to this, okay? I didn't quiz him during that time. Technically, he's kind of right. I was doing some work for a company in Belgium, and they had a number of issues, but they had run out of storage space because the SAN guy said, I got to have 1 LUN for every virtual machine. And they couldn't afford a new storage device. It wasn't in the budget that year, so they had to get by for another 4 or 5 months. Okay? So I came in and helped them kind of analyze some things. They were spending, that storage guy was spending 1 day, every day, all day long, doing nothing but resizing LUNs. That's all he got done, resizing LUNs to handle the changes in the virtual machine disks, and everything's a nightmare, right? Not fun. The question I asked the guy is, why having 1 LUN per VM do you say is the best performance? What I was disappointed in is he couldn't answer the question. He just said it is. Now, I'm talking about iSCSI. Fiber Channel has something similar if you're a Fiber Channel guy, okay? There is a queue depth on every path associated with your storage devices on the host. And if you have, say, 8 paths, there's no use having more than 8 LUNs because you aren't going to have more ways to go down a path, go to that thing anyway. Doesn't matter. Having 1 LUN per VM is overkill. So what we normally recommend is, hey, the maximum you should ever need is 1 LUN per total path. All the paths. That's the maximum you should ever need because you'll never reach that queue depth. And even if you do, it doesn't matter much because you don't have more paths anyways. So you'll never get better performance than that, right? More LUNs generally means better performance, but not always. And you definitely don't need to have 1 LUN per path. Or sorry, 1 LUN per VM. 1 LUN per path is important. Now, coming back up to vVols. Virtual volumes released with Vsphere 6. They've been showing it for like 3 years at VMworld. By the way, I'm missing VMworld just for you guys. I'm going to go to the one in Barcelona instead. Yeah, almost, right? So anyways, vVols. In essence, you take your storage box, and it has to support it, and you'll present the storage box as an entity, as an entire volume, or a portion of it as a volume. It connects to VMware. VMware now has access to, let's just say, 20 terabytes of storage. Not a LUN, just 20 terabytes of storage, raw storage, presented to it from the SAN vendor. Okay? When you create a VM, go about creating a VM. It will create a LUN, the size necessary to handle your virtual machine files, period. And you end up with one LUN per VM, and you did nothing. You don't have to manage it. It's just done. Simple. You end up with one LUN per VM, but we reduce the management. I like that. Isn't that good? A number of the SAN vendors currently support vVols. The others are coming online probably by the end of this year, if not first quarter of next. There's a lot of that stuff happening. And ask your vendor. They'll probably be able to have a firmware update if you don't already have it anyways, and you can make use of virtual volumes. It's a nice little addition. Does that make sense? Kind of, right? All right. Don't forget about proper number of LUNs. That's a cool one, right? Yeah, so 4 paths per host. If you had 4 hosts, you'd have maximum 16 LUNs. But like I said here, you generally don't need that. You generally don't need that many. So I remember working with a company a while back. They had 20 hosts. They had 4 paths per host. I was not going to create 80 LUNs. They only had 200 VMs. We created 10 LUNs from what they had 2, and they saw significant improvement. We left room to be able to grow and add more if necessary, but the performance was good. Take a look at the queue depth. We're all happy, right? Good stuff. So there you go. A couple of minor things here. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Correct. Yep. Yeah, and the reason that Nimble, I like Nimble products, we're good. The reason that Nimble says that is simply because of the way that they handle that. Every LUN that they create is going to span all of their disks. So it doesn't matter how many VMs, you're not going to have degradation one way or the other. The only thing you got to watch for is, on this end, is what's the queue depth. You know, what do you end up for a queue depth, and is it an issue? Most fiber channel environments, I never run into a queuing issue anyways, because it works pretty darn quick. And iSCSI environments, it just depends upon all over the place. But yeah, I totally agree with their statement, their thought process. Mm-hmm. Yep. I only have a few minutes left, and I think I want to end with looking at some different hardware options, because that was one of the things on the list. So I'm just going to talk about some different storage vendors out there. And I am not choosing one over the other. I'm just giving you 3 examples. And these three examples, I need a beer. These 3 examples that I chose to share have to do with what happened at VMworld a couple of years ago. So at VMworld, every year they have hands-on labs. And there will be 600-700 individuals in there all the time doing labs. These labs are spun up. They're cool, right? Pretty good. These labs are spun up really quick. Well, a couple of years back, they invited these 3 vendors, EMC, NetApp, and Nexenta, in to support that infrastructure. This was before they started using cloud. All right? Now, it was interesting. Within the first hour, NetApp crashed and burned. EMC, nice and steady. However, EMC couldn't support more than what was originally planned for them. That Nexenta box, not only did it keep doing what it was supposed to, it took over everything that NetApp couldn't handle. Now, what's the difference in these technologies, right? EMC's got good, solid products, and they use everything under the sun between, they got tiered caching for read, right? They have a unique way that they handle their writes. I don't understand it completely because they won't share all the details with me because it's proprietary. Works really pretty good. NetApp is interesting. Yeah, you can have it full SSD, SAN, you can have, SAS, mix, whatever you want. But the difficulty with NetApp is that they actually use NFS as a thin layer between the hardware and everything else that you're utilizing. So you actually have another layer you're dealing with. NetApp has a tremendous amount of features. The features are easy to implement because they have an NFS layer in there. Kind of interesting, right? So you've got EMC, you got NetApp, and then you got this weird thing called Nexenta. How many have heard of Nexenta? Oh, that's interesting. So Nexenta is a software-defined storage solution. You can go buy a supported Dell, HP, Supermicro box as long as it is supported, has the correct hardware, you can then install Nexenta on it. What makes Nexenta different than the other guys is it utilizes 3 different types, actually 4 different types of components for storage. So it uses spinning rust SAS drives for its general storage. It uses read-optimized SSDs for the Tier 2 storage, for the Tier 2 read cache. It uses memory for the Tier 1 cache. And then it uses write-optimized SSDs for the write cache. So all of your writes are written to that SSD and then flushed down to the SAS drive. What I have seen is for about half the money, you can get as good a performance out of Nexenta as you can EMC. But here's my problem with Nexenta. Their support is up and down. Some years they're unbelievable. The next year they're crap. So if you think about using Nexenta, make sure you find consultants that know what they're doing with it so you don't have to worry about support with Nexenta. Okay? Now, we've caused enough worries for them that they're starting to get their ducks back in a row again, because this last year was one of those down years. So that's kind of some difference with the storage realm is changing. One of the other things I haven't added in there, VMware's got this vSAN, right? Virtual SAN. What's so cool about the vSAN? I just had a client, small client, bought 4 hosts. Education, wanted to spend as little money as possible, went with Supermicro. I don't have a problem with that, just telling you, okay? Supermicro boxes, purchased, he ended up with 64 terabytes of storage on 4 boxes, okay? SSD on each box for read cache, and then spinning Rust, SAS drives for the rest. Including 4 servers, 256 gigs of RAM, dual 6-core processors, 10 gig NICs on down the line, 64 terabytes of storage, with licensing for vSAN, a little over 40 grand. 4 hosts, 64 terabytes of storage, with Nexenta, with vSAN licensing. That didn't include the VMware licensing. With vSAN licensing, just a little over 40 grand. That's not too bad, is it? Pretty reasonable. Made sense why they went with that. Now, what do I love about that? What happens is, in that environment, you create a LUN, you don't know which host the LUN is on all the hosts. When you've got a virtual machine running on this host, all of its files are sitting on that host, and there's a replica elsewhere. And every host has a replica on the others. Pretty amazing stuff. So you got the redundancy built into it, and it is very fast because it's sitting there. Now you think about how much normally goes over the network. All those reads, whether you're using an EMC, NetApp, doesn't matter. All those reads are going across the network. We've removed all that. Now the only thing going across the network is the changes to the disk that is being replicated. That is a lot less traffic. Probably 70% less. That's considerable. Pretty cool stuff. So we're seeing some really neat improvements moving to that kind of an environment. Which leads me into the separate license from VMware. Does not. Does not matter what edition. That's a good question. I think you have to be standard. But it doesn't, standard on up, it doesn't matter. Pernix data. Good stuff. Good stuff. I like Pernix data. Infinio IO also. So Pernix data is really good for write IOs, correct? Infinio IO, really good for optimizing reads. Both of those products are really good in a desktop environment, VDI environment. I do like them. They do a great job. Now, we're moving to a software-defined environment. Everything defined. Yeah. The software. It takes time. and not everybody needs to go to a software-defined environment, right? It all depends upon where you're at today and what you really think you need in 5 years or so. Every design that we're doing today, we're planning on, we're setting up and designing so that it'll be easy to implement anything along the lines for software-defined data centers as we go along. But not everybody's going to go there. We're just making sure they don't have to recreate the wheel, right? No use redesigning the whole thing. I'm almost finished. Okay, so I'll finish up here. Excuse me, hyper-converged hardware. Anybody seen any? Anybody heard of Nutanix? Hyper-converged hardware. How about simplicity?